Gonna tap back into some book reading. Gonna start with the autobiography of Malcolm X. Gonna jump back into that. All right. At the end of my talk, I heard, yes, we support the African American morally, physically, materially, if necessary, in Ghana or in all of Black Africa. My highest single honor was an audience at the castle with ASAJFO Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Before seeing him, I was searched most thoroughly. I respected the type of security the Ghanaians erect around their leader. It gave me that much more respect for independent black men. Then, as I entered Dr. Nkrumah's long office, he came out from behind his desk at the far end. Dr. Nkrumah wore ordinary dress. With ordinary dress, his hand was extended and a smile was on his sensitive face. I pumped his hand. We sat on a couch and talked. I knew that he was particularly well informed on the Afro American's plight, as for years he had lived and studied in America. We discussed the unity of Africans and peoples of African descent. We agreed that Pan Africanism was the key also to the problems of those African heritage. I could feel the warm, likable, and very down-to-earth qualities of Dr. Nkrumah. My time with him was up all too soon. I promised faithfully that when I returned to the United States, I would relay to Afro Americans his personal warm regards. That afternoon, 39 miles away in Winneba, I spoke at the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute, where 200 students were being trained to carry forward Ghana's intellectual revolution. And here again occurred one of those astounding demonstrations of the young African's political fervor. After I had spoken, during the question and answer period, some young Afro Americans stood up, whom none there seemed to know. I am an American Negro, he announced himself. Vaguely, he defended the American white man. The African students booed and harassed him. Then instantly, when the meeting was over, they cornered this fellow with verbal abuse. Are you an agent of Rockefeller? Stop corrupting our children. The fellow had turned out to be a local secondary school teacher, placed in the job by an American agency. Come to this institute for some orientation. Temporarily, a teacher rescued the fellow, but then the students rushed him and drove him away, shouting, "Stooge, CIA, American agent." Chinese ambassador and Miss Huang Hua gave a state dinner in my honor. The guests included the Cuban and the Algerian ambassadors, and also it was here that I met Miss W.E.B. Du Bois. After the excellent dinner, 3 films were shown. One, a color film, depicted the People's Republic of China in celebration of its 14th anniversary. Prominently shown in this film was the militant former North Carolina Afro-American Robert Williams, who has since taken refuge in Cuba after his advocacy that the American black people should take up arms to defend and protect themselves. The second film focused upon the Chinese people's support for the Afro-American struggle. Interesting. Chairman Mao Zedong was shown delivering his statement of that support, and the film offered sickening moments of graphic white brutality, police and civilian, to Afro Americans who were demonstrating in various U.S. cities seeking civil rights. And the final film was a dramatic presentation of the Algerian Revolution. The Malcolm X committee rushed me from the Chinese embassy dinner to where SOAR and my honor had already begun at the press club. It was my first sight of Ghanaians dancing the high life. A high and merry time was being had by everyone, and I was pressed to make a short speech. I stressed again the need for unity between Africans and Afro-Americans. I cried out of my heart. Now dance, sing, but as you do, remember Mandela, remember Sebokwe, remember Lumumba in his grave, remember South Africans now in jail. I said, you'll wonder why I don't dance? Because I want you to remember 22 million Africans in the U.S., but I sure felt like dancing. The Ghanaians performed the high life as if possessed. One pretty African girl sang Blue Moon like Sarah Vaughan. Sometimes the band sounded like Milt Jackson, sometimes like Charlie Parker. The next morning, a Saturday, I heard that Cassius Clay and his entourage had arrived. There was a huge reception for him at the airport. I thought that if Cassius and I happened to meet, it would likely prove embarrassing for Cassius, since he had elected to remain with Elijah Muhammad's version of Islam. I would not have been embarrassed, but I knew that Cassius would have been forbidden to associate with me. I knew that Cassius knew I had been with him and for him and believed in him. When those who later embraced him felt that he had no chance, I decided to avoid Cassius so as not to put him on the spot. A luncheon was given for me that afternoon by the Nigerian High Commissioner, His Excellency Alhaji Isa Wali, a short, bespectacled, extremely warm and friendly man who had lived in Washington, D.C. for 2 years. After lunch, His Excellency spoke to the guest of his American encounters with discrimination and of friendships he had made with African Americans, and he reaffirmed the bonds between Africans and Afro Americans. His Excellency held up before the luncheon guest a large and handsome issue of an American magazine, Horizon. It was open to an article about the Nation of Islam written by Dr. Morrow Berger of Princeton University. One full page was a photograph of me. The opposite full page was a beautiful color illustration of a black royal Nigerian Muslim, stalwart and handsome of hundreds of years ago. Stalwart and handsome of hundreds of years ago. In quotations, when I look at these photographs, I know these two people are one, said His Excellency. The only difference is in their attire, and one was born in America and the other in Africa. So to let everyone know that I believe we are brothers, I am going to give to Alhaji Malcolm X a robe like that worn by the Nigerian in this photo. I was overwhelmed by the splendor of the beautiful blue robe and the orange turban which His Excellency then presented to me. Pause there. Next, we're going to dump into the Frederick Douglass. My bag. So, we'll tap back in here. Okay. Y plantation yards. He was a busy overseer of the overseers, managing the economic and labor demands of a huge agricultural and commercial enterprise. But on at least one occasion, Douglas remembered old master's affectionate disposition, gently leading me by the hand, as he sometimes did, patting me on the head, speaking to me in soft, caressing tones, and calling me his little Indian boy. Douglas used this almost fatherly act as a background for a withering portrait of a smoldering volcano, a brittle, unhappy man of haggard aspect, muttering to himself as he stormed about, cursing and just gesticulating at his invisible foes. Born in 1667, Born in 1767, Aaron Anthony was the seventh and the final child of poor, illiterate farmers from the Tuckahoe Neck, the land immediately across the Tuckahoe River to the east in Caroline County. Douglas later described the poor whites such as Anthony who hailed from there as the lowest order, indolent and drunken to a proverb. Like Frederick Bailey, Anthony was an orphan, but parents died when he was a child. Who made his own way in the world and became a self-made man from extremely humble roots. He loved and managed money well. Like many Eastern shoremen, he also he also handled boats well, became a seaman and a captain eventually of the most prominent schooner on Chesapeake Bay, owned and operated by Edward Lloyd, almost always upwardly mobile. Captain Anthony, as he was often called, married up to Anne Catherine Skinner in 1797 and soon took up residence in a rent-free house on the Lloyd's Y plantation as a head overseer of some 13 farms, nearly 10,000 acres, wow, and more than 500 slaves. Since he owned Betsy Bailey as a slaveholder, Anthony likely did not need to buy more slaves of his own. Apart from the 10 children Betsy herself bore from 1799 to 1826, her 5 daughters gave birth to at least 20 more among them. By any measure, Anthony was a success story as the manager of the Lloyd slave empire and owner of the 3 large farms of his own that he rented out, at least until after his wife died in 1818, the year Douglas was born. From then until his death in November 1826, Anthony may have descended into mental instability and increased sexual aggression. Douglas famously recorded an incident that gives credence to this image of Anthony as an old and angry, lecherous, and violent. Shortly after arriving at the White House at age 6 and joining the swarm of slave children there, Douglas was asleep early one morning in his normal place, the floor, closet, on the floor of a rough closet, which opened into the kitchen. He was awakened by the shrieks and piteous cries of his 15-year-old Aunt Hester. Anthony had dragged her into the kitchen at dawn and made her strip to the waist, forced her to stand on a bench on her toes as her wrists were tied to a wooden joist above her head. Old Master stood behind Hester, her neck shoulders and back entirely naked, an ugly cowskin switch, the lash in his hand, shouting the shouting dead bitch and other epithets, too coarse and blasphemous for readers to bear. Little Frederick looked on in horror through cracks in the boards as Anthony adjusted the whip in his hand, studied his feet for leverage, and dealt one overhand blow after another to the young woman's bleeding neck and shoulder blades. The blood dripped on her clothes and down to the floor. The old man clenched his teeth, gripped the gripped the cowskin, and delivered his torture, seemingly delighted with the scene. Embedded in Douglas's rendering of this scene is his broader discussion of Anthony's motives for such a beating. Hester had been seeing a young slave teenager, Ned Roberts, also 15 years old, and Douglas and Douglas describes both of them as beautiful and attractive young people falling in love. Hester had rejected Anthony's advances and paid dearly for it on that morning. Anthony, Douglas reported, wanted to break up the growing intimacy of the young lovers, but his efforts were to no avail. Douglas turned this episode of his childhood into a parable about the sexual corruption and the spirit-killing immorality at the center of the master-slave relationship. Hester lived with the curse of her personal beauty, and Ned with his almost powerless desire to court and marry her. The jealous Anthony's intentions were apparent in every sense. His methods, foolish, what slavery so lacked in sexual and familial relations, Douglas offered was a sense of normalcy, of the peace in which to love freely. Hester should have been free to give her affections to the handsome young man she liked, and Ned free to become a husband. But who or what? Asked Douglas, the autobiographer. Was this old master his answer? A tyrant with no bounds, a torturer, a man any civilized society would try and convict for his awful criminality. But Alice, Anthony, exhausted from the whipping, wiping off the blood clotted cowskin, ushered the mangled and weeping Hester out of the kitchen, not knowing that a little boy crouched in a closet, peering in terror at the blood on the floor. Wasn't prepared for this. Douglas crafting of the beating of his beautiful young arm is a former slave's recitation of an overwhelmingly vivid, traumatic memory of a morning and a slave boy's terrible education. It took him many years to understand and find the language for the rage that old master's whip and Hester's blood had left in him. If anything had been his father, if Anthony had been his father, Douglas dearly wanted to know the truth, but more important, he put him to use as a symbol, the sexual predator in the evil system that ruined all decency and humanity. Unforgivingly, Douglas made Anthony into the father of fathers among slaveholders. He turned that haunting whisper of his youth, "Master is your father," into a condemnation of sexual abuse and its spawn of hundreds of thousands of mulatto children at the heart of slavery in America. The pain of not knowing with certainty the identity of his own father paled him. He implied next to the collective reality he witnessed. The slave status of a child was always that of the mother under American slave law. This arrangement, Douglas declared, admits of the greatest license to brutal slaveholders and their profligate sons, brothers, relations, and friends, and gives to the pleasure of sin the additional attraction of profit. A whole volume might be written on this single feature of slavery as I have observed it. Douglas experienced lasting individual trauma over his roots in this world of rural, lonely, familial, and violent sexual anguish. Few Americans ever more publicly and vividly remade themselves over and over quite like Douglas, and few had deeper reasons to try. Slavery meant to make him a brute, Douglas wrote. But what man has made a man can unmake. But what man has made, man can unmake. If indeed his 20-year-old mother, still full of flowering beauty, youthful charm, and intelligence, had been raped by this power besotted, sexually deranged 50-year-old Anthony, Douglas had to find some story or analysis in which to comprehend it as he grew to adulthood. By retrieving his story from memory, he also had to try to dissolve it as he also created it. If he understood that he had not been conceived in love, then he could never know a father's love, although he would seek alternative fathers for much of his life. A man who will enslave his own blood, he insisted, may not be safely relied on for magnanimity. Men do not love those who remind them of their sins unless they have a mind to repent. And the mulatto child's face is a standing accusation against him who is master and father to the child. Douglass wrote about his paternity with an acute and strategic sense of fatherlessness. Anthony, or whichever white man, pursued Harriet Bailey into her quarters or in the back of a kitchen in the dark, produced ultimately an angry Frederick Douglass who would find the words to fight back. The extent of slavery's sexual assault on the idea of family, Douglass wearily claimed, was beyond the design of my simple story. Hardly so much racial mixture had emerged from American slavery. Douglass argued that if the lineal descendants of Ham are only to be enslaved according to the scriptures, slavery in this country will soon become an unscriptural institution, for thousands are ushered into the world annually who, like myself, owe their existence to white fathers and most frequently to their masters and masters' sons. Douglass knew this element of his story was old, complex, and to most salacious. He told it about as explicitly as he could. The thoughtful, he said, know the rest. In his abolitionist writings and his oratory, Douglass seldom missed an opportunity to convert his story into ways of defining slavery itself to his uninformed audiences. The orphan's anguished story of his roots in Tuckahoe, the parents unknown or vanished, provided the perfect chance to tear out his reader's heart as he bared his own. There is not beneath the sky an enemy to filial affection so destructive as slavery. It had made my brothers enemy. It had made my brothers and sisters strangers to me. It converted my mother, who bore me, into a myth. It shrouded my father in mystery and left me without an intelligible beginning in the world. But in such cries in the night, he did tell us a good deal of what remained intelligible in his furtive memory. The first things Douglass did actually know and experience were boyhood memories of life at his grandmother's cabin, the trek to the Y plantation, the great house farm, and his half-naked, half-starved time as a 7 and 8 year old. Oh, and and 7 to 8 year olds, why scrounging for morsels of food and affection wherever he could find them. Even deeper, it was from and in and around Grandma Betsy's log hut built of clay, wood, and straw that Douglas, the adult writer, conjured his first memories. His memory flowed with images of the grandmother's majestic presence, her freshly ironed bandana, how esteemed she was on both sides of the Tuckahoe for her skills in planting and preserving seedling sweet potatoes. As symbol and reality, Douglas gave us the first great yams in African American literature. Betsy perfected the art of placing the root of the potato at just the right depth and position so it would endure the the winter's frosts, a talent for which she was recruited all over the region to assist others, slave and free. Among Douglas's first things was the well outside the cabin where all the children, too many to count, and almost all his cousins would play, compete, and scheme. And then there was the simple, if if magical, ladder inside the cabin. For Fred Bailey, the ladder up to a makeshift loft was one of those childhood objects or images that zipped in and out of his memory, a really high invitation, and possessed of a sort of charm. Possessed of a sort of charm. Eating his quick meals of cornmeal with an oyster shell, dashing to and fro, and always craving his grandmother's attentions with deep seriousness against the bids of all the other urchins in the yard, and prancing across a cornfield to the busy mill up toward Hillsboro. These memories allowed Douglas to create a self-portrait of a boy in a state of nature. Slave children are children, he instructed his romantic readers. In his earliest years, he could imagine he had been a genuine boy, running while running wild at times. Running wild at times, enacting by turns all the strange antics and freaks of horses, dogs, pigs, and barn door fowls without incurring reproach. The, this little boy, protected by the seemingly powerful matriarch at the bend in the Tuckahoe, could trot on, as happy as any little heathen under the palm trees of Africa, or so the story demanded in his brilliant recreation of childhood innocence peculiar to slavery. Just before the fall, when befuddling rumors of old master's absolute power began to invade his euphoria, clouds and shadows began to descend on him. He was told that Captain Anthony brought all the slave children at a certain age to his own homestead. Soon, Douglas kept hearing around Grandma Bailey's sanctuary he would see sights by and by. I'm gonna pause there. Some heavy stuff, man. It's just heavy, you know. It's just heavy. It's like it's hard to process. It's hard to comprehend. It's hard to imagine and just realize everything that we have been through, everything we have come from, everything that has been inflicted on us, everything that has happened to us, everything that has been experienced and endured by us, the resilience that we have had to display for generations and generations and centuries and decades. It's impeccable. It's unbelievable. This is Justice Blind. Justice Blind by Matthew B. Robinson. I believe we left off. Preliminary hearing, grand jury. Assuming a case is not dismissed, the next stage in the criminal justice process is either a preliminary hearing or a grand jury, depending on the jurisdiction in which the case is being heard. Both of these mechanisms are ideally intended to ensure that innocent persons are not hastily, maliciously, or arbitrarily prosecuted. In reality, these processes are typically one-sided and almost always resulting in a finding that there is probable cause to warrant a person being detained until trial. This can be a major impediment to fairness in the criminal justice process because findings of preliminary hearings and grand juries are routinely published in local media, perhaps creating assumptions among the public that named defendants are already guilty of crimes, even though in fact they have not yet been convicted of anything. In about half of the states, a preliminary hearing is held to determine if there is enough evidence to hold the case over for trial. If the judge does not find probable cause that the named persons committed the named offense, the case may be dismissed and filtered out of the criminal justice network. In cases where the judge finds probable cause, the accused is held for trial on the basis of an information, which is a formal charging document against the accused. In federal cases and in other states, a grand jury is impaneled to determine if there is enough evidence to file an indictment charging the suspect with the named crimes. If the grand jury, made up of a panel of civilians, finds that there is sufficient evidence to warrant a trial, it issues a true bill which charges the defendant with a crime. If not, it issues a no bill, which means the defendant is not charged with a crime, and he or she is filtered out of the criminal justice network. Again, the vast majority of cases heard by a grand jury lead to an indictment. This has led some to call the grand jury process a rubber stamp for the prosecution. Arraignment. At an arraignment, the next step in the process, the accused is read the information or indictment by the judge. The suspect then has the right to enter a plea of guilty, not guilty, or nolo contendere. No contest. All right. Upon a plea of guilty or no contest, sentencing may take place immediately because a trial is not necessary to determine guilt. Pleas of guilty are not to be accepted by the judge unless several assurances from the accused are received. The reality is that plea bargaining occurs in more than 90% of all cases before U.S. courts, and the suspect is presumed guilty by virtually all involved, including the suspect's own attorney. Pause there.